This is deGaris Essays, that is 2-3 page opinion pieces on such topics as species dominance, global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. This essay is in the section on society, essay number 9, entitled Living as a Sage in a Peakered Society by Prof. Dr. Hugo deGaris. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Flyer itself. This flyer proposes the creation of a new kind of social/political liberation movement called Sages Lib, similar to the liberation movements for the blacks, women, the aged, etc., that fought against racism, sexism, ageism, etc. I'll begin with the definition of some basic terms, then present the case that sages are discriminated against, and finally suggest ways in which discrimination against sages can be combated. I begin with some definitions. A sage, that's one syllable, is an intellectual, that's 5 syllables. Sageism is anti-intellectualism, that is 3 syllables as against a whopping 9 syllables. A sagist is a person who discriminates against sages, that is 2 syllables against the 7 syllables of the term anti-intellectual. I've always held the view that there can be tremendous power in labels because they focus attention on novel concepts. For example, when a person hears the term sagist for the first time, instinctively that person asks, what does sagist mean? When told, that person has a new concept put in his head, a new idea, so that the next time he hears the term, he is familiar with what it means and can understand what the person who uses the term when talking to him is talking about. By using a new label, a new concept, a new meme is created that can then spread throughout the population, creating a consciousness in that population that may benefit the category of people who invented the term in the first place. An obvious example is the way the homosexuals invented the term gay to label themselves, creating a term which was much shorter and easier to use than the multi-syllabic term homosexual with its 5 syllables against 1 syllable for gay. The very choice of the word gay gives the homosexuals a positive connotation, since the word gay used to mean happy, carefree, fun-loving. The homosexuals, or gays, wanted to transmit to the heterosexual population the idea that being gay was gay, that is, not necessarily be something miserable. Prior to the use of the term gay, homosexuals were thought to live rather miserable lives, since they were so discriminated against and legally prosecuted by the law. Look at the way the British government treated Alan Turing, the father of the modern programmed computer. He was forced to either go to prison or to take female hormones, which turned his male mathematical brain to mush and pushed him into suicide. There's a close analogy to be made between the social and legal situation of the gays before they were gays half a century ago and the intellectuals, or sages, today. Just as the homosexuals needed to be liberated from social and legal discrimination against them by the heterosexuals half a century ago, so do the intellectuals, the sages, need to be liberated today against the discrimination against them by the peakers, a new term I need to define. A peaker is a person of average IQ, an average Joe, whose IQ places him in the peak of the IQ distribution curve, that is, the bell curve. In Euro-American culture, the average IQ of these populations is 100. Peakers are people whose IQs lie between plus and minus 1 standard deviation of the mean, that is, the average value of 100. That is, lying between 85 and 115. 2/3 of the population lie between these two IQ limits, that is, the large majority of the population. What is meant by the term Peakered society in the title of this essay? Western advanced nations are affluent. As a consequence, much of society is geared towards them, because peakers are the vast bulk of the population. They are the ad mass. For example, look at pop, that is popular music, ads, movies, newspapers, radio, TV programs, magazines, etc. To the extent that most of these institutions are commercial, that is, out to make a profit, then not surprisingly, the content of these products are aimed at the IQ levels of the people who make up the majority of the population, that is, the peakers, who possess most of the dollars used to buy these cultural products. For example, there would be no point in making a movie that was aimed at the subs, that is, the bottom sixth of the population, who are dumber, that is, have lower IQs than the peakers, or at the soups, that is, the sixth of the population who are smarter, that is, have higher IQs than the peakers. For the obvious reason that more profit could be made by the movie-making company by pitching the movie at an IQ level suitable for the peakers, that is, the movie makers peaker the movie, using the term peaker as a verb, or expressed alternatively, the movie is peakered. The above logic applies to many forms of social product. For example, pop music, which is very much a commercial business, aimed definitely at the peakers, which is where most of the purchasing power lies. There would be no point in broadcasting a Bruckner symphony on a pop music radio station, because then 5/6 or more of the listeners would switch to another radio station, because classical music is not peakered. It's a music form that is saged, aimed at soups and sages, wafting way above the musical heads of peakers, and hence would be ununderstandable by peakers, and hence boring to them. If you're a sage, that is, an intellectual, someone with an IQ in the top percentile, that is, the top 1%, love playing with ideas, has a PhD, writes books, etc., then living in a peaked society can be a real pain, an alienating experience, since so many of the products of society are not geared towards the needs of sages. To be a sage in a peaked society is to be alienated, ignored, misunderstood. In fact, it's worse than that. To be a sage in a peaked society is usually to be prejudiced against, to be ridiculed, to be labelled with pejorative terms such as nerd, egghead, geek, dweeb, etc. by peakers. Sages in their teens have a particularly hard time of it, because in their high school environments, they're usually the only one of their kind in their high school class, so are unable to share their intelligence with others in their class at their IQ level, for obvious statistical reasons. In a class of, say, 50 students, there will be only one student who is a sage, using the above definition. These young sage students usually feel lonely and isolated, so learn to keep their true interests and abilities to themselves, who then really only start to blossom once they have filtered themselves with their high IQs into the top universities with other students of similar abilities. But even then, they still suffer from the peaked society they live in. The gays are about 1% of males and about half of 1% of females, so are definitely a small minority. Similarly with the sages, blacks are also a minority, but larger, that is about 10% of the US population. Sages need their own liberation movement so that life for them in a peaked society, which is not going to go away, can be made pleasanter. In today's society, there's no real consciousness, no real awareness on the part of peakers that they discriminate against sages and that they shouldn't. Sages need to become vocal about being who they are, telling peakers that if peakers use terms like nerd, geek, egghead, brainiac, dork, dweeb, etc., that is expressing their sageism against sages, then that is as morally bad as if they express racist terms like nigger, darky, etc. towards blacks, or sexist terms like broad, chick, cunt, bitch, etc. towards women, or ageist terms like old fart, old timer, greybeard, etc. towards seniors. Sages need to organise into a Sages Lib movement and call out people, usually peakers, who discriminate against sages, telling them in strong negative terms that they are sageist, that is, anti-intellectuals. If the peakers insist on continuing to use such pejorative labels against the sages, then the sages can retaliate with equally pejorative terms to give these sadist peakers a taste of their own medicine by labelling them peakers, subs, beta brains, dullards, etc. Peakers need to be taught by the sages that the peakers cannot expect that the supes and the sages should behave towards peakers as though sages have the same level of intelligence as peakers, which sages obviously don't. Often, peakers will have IQs that are a whopping 50 IQ points lower than sages. A 100 IQ point peaker belongs almost to a different species compared to a sage who is a whopping 50 IQ points smarter than him. Sages need to teach peakers that peakers cannot expect sages to behave like or to have the interests of peakers. Sages are not peakers. Peakers need to learn the mantra that sages are to peakers as peakers are to subs. Peakers know from their daily experience that there are people who are a lot dumber than them, that is, the subs, who are the dumbest sixth of the population. Peakers are used to dealing with such subs and usually do not assert their intellectual superiority at the expense of the egos of the subs, who obviously don't like being told by peakers that subs are dumber than peakers. Similarly, peakers need to be told by sages that peakers are not the centre of the universe, although given that so much of society is peakered, geared towards them, that it's easy for peakers to get that impression. Peakers need to learn that there is a category of people who are a lot smarter than them, who strongly dislike living in a peakered society with its pop music, its peakered movies, its peakered TV and radio, etc. Peakers need to learn to stop discriminating against sages and learn to respect them, since sages are a lot smarter than them. Sages are the people who create and drive society, since they are the inventors, the scientists, the composers, the creators, etc. Sages should be respected by peakers. What can be done to improve the lives of sages? Firstly, there needs to be a sages lib that makes society conscious of the need for sages to be liberated from peaker discrimination towards them, to free sages from the unconscious expectation that peakers have that sages should behave and have the interest of peakers, which is definitely not the case. Sages are bored by peakery, that is, the amusement of peakers. Often sages will despise pop music, be utterly bored by the inanity of Hollywood movies, which are aimed at the peakers, be bored by the conversation of peakers, etc. Sages are not peakers, and peakers need to learn that. It should not be too difficult for peakers to make the analogy that sages are to peakers as peakers are to subs. Peakers know they are smarter than subs, so should be able to imagine that there is a sage class that are smarter than peakers, and just learn to live with that fact and not discriminate against sages. If peakers do express hostility towards sages, then peakers should expect to be castigated by sages by being labelled peakers, subs, dumbums, etc. The two communities need to learn to tolerate each other and to live and let live. I won't annoy you if you don't annoy me. Peakers need to become conscious of the terms sage and sageist so that they become aware that they are discriminating against sages and to learn to stop it. Otherwise there'll be an ideological war between the two groups, with the sages using their superior intelligence to crush the egos of the discriminating peakers. It will not be a pleasant experience for the peakers. So Peakers need to learn to live and let live with the sages, even if it's only a strategy of mutual indifference, a mutual ignoring of each other. Peakers have their peakery, for example, sports, movies, pop music, TV, radio, etc. And the sages have their sagery, for example, science, math, philosophy, literature, theatre, etc. The two groups may have little in common, but at least some degree of peace between them can be established by keeping it a benign peace. Governments can also help the sages by providing more sagery, that is, social intellectual products that are aimed at the sages, for example, intellectual lectures, courses, media, etc., that are aimed deliberately at people with sage IQ levels, that are an intellectual challenge and hence stimulating for sages, and not utterly boring, as is peakery for sages. A similar logic also holds for the subs, who are also largely ignored by a peakered society. Commerce will of course continue to aim to maximise profits, so society will remain peakered to a large extent, but governments can help overcome this. Also, commerce can make social/intellectual products aimed at the sages/soups as English becomes increasingly the world language, thus creating a world market of millions of sages across the world. Similarly for the subs, although the subs with their bottom 6th IQ levels will have a harder time learning the world language to create their own worldwide sub-market. Governments have the moral duty to cater to both subs and soups, which is something that they tend to ignore today. That needs to change. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo deGaris. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com, which contains links to all my essays. Ciao.